Long before the photograph at Kitty Hawk froze a biplane against a winter sky, two brothers in a small Ohio shop decided the real problem of flight was not lift or power. It was command. Birds do not merely rise, they balance, bank, and recover. A machine that could not be steered would never be safe, and one that could not be stabilized would never be practical. So Orville and Wilbur Wright set themselves to master the grammar of air. Roll, pitch, yaw. 3 axes, 1 solution. They began not with spectacle, but with method. Bicycles taught them that balance is an active act, a constant conversation between instability and correction. Gliders taught them that air does not read theory the way books do. Their notebooks filled with numbers, failures, and small victories, angles, pressures, curves. Where others chased more fabric and bigger engines, the brothers built tools. A wind tunnel on a workbench, delicate balances that weighed force like a jeweler weighs gold. The data told a new truth about airfoils, and from that truth came a new way to move through the sky. On the Carolina sands, they turned this method into muscle memory. Wing warping to command roll. A forward elevator to bite the wind for pitch. A movable rudder to tame yaw and tie the system together. Each decision was a link in a chain, and when every link held, the impossible began to look repeatable. December 17th, 1903, was not a finish line. It was a proof. 4 brief flights that announced a principle. Controlled, powered flight could be done by design, not luck. The world saw a moment. The brothers saw a beginning. Behind that famous image stood the quiet revolution that made it possible. Experiment before exhibition, numbers before headlines, control before horsepower. From a bicycle shop to a strip of sand, from sketches to a machine that could be turned, held, and recovered. This is how flight began in America. Not as a leap into the unknown, but as an argument settled with evidence, written in wind and tested against the earth. Defining the problem, bicycles, balance, and the math of control. Begin in Dayton, where a storefront full of spokes, chains, and careful hands became a workshop for the sky. The Wrights ran a bicycle business the way a laboratory is run. Measure first, adjust precisely, test honestly, and let the result tell you what to do next. A bicycle is a lesson in humility. It never balances itself. You ride it by creating balance from imbalance, by steering into a lean, by making small, continuous inputs that keep a narrow machine upright on a narrow line. To anyone obsessed with machines that move through air, that lesson is not metaphor. It is law. Stability is not a property you bolt on at the end. It is a relationship between a craft and a pilot, negotiated in real time. Orville and Wilbur looked at the newspaper headlines of their day, grand schemes for giant wings and powerful engines, and saw a category error. If the true problem were horsepower, the strongest workshop would win. But the record of the pioneers said otherwise. Otto Lilienthal, whose glides made the world believe a man could float, died because the machine would not obey when a gust struck. Magnificent kites and elegant triplanes drifted and dove, but when trouble came, they could not be commanded out of it. The brothers could read the pattern until a pilot could assert control in roll, pitch, and yaw, bank, raise, or lower the nose, coordinate a turn. Flight would remain a party trick, not a craft. They began with books and letters. They studied Lilienthal's data on airfoils and Octave Chanut's surveys of every attempt at flight. They wrote to the Smithsonian and to Chanut himself, who answered generously, treating them not as curious shopkeepers, but as colleagues joining the problem at the right level. In the pages they noticed an unease. Numbers disagreed with one another, and the performances reported in the field did not match the lift promised on paper. The brothers were practical men. If wind did not behave as advertised, you did not argue with wind, you measured it. The measurement plan was simple in principle and radical in practice. Build a device that makes invisible forces visible. They set a wooden box on a bench, a wind tunnel driven by a simple fan, and inside it mounted exquisitely sensitive balances of their own design. A thin arm would hold a small wing shape, flat plates, cambered surfaces, long and short spans, and the balances would register lift and drag separately. They controlled speed and angle, compared one model to another, and took nothing on faith. The arithmetic behind every reading was kept consistent. Force grew with the square of velocity, with area, with a coefficient earned by the shape itself. What the textbooks called constants, the brothers treated as suspects. They recalibrated the standard Smeaton coefficient used to estimate dynamic pressure, lowering it significantly from the traditional value. Suddenly, the puzzle of disappointing glides made sense. Earlier predictions had been too generous. Real air was stingier than assumed. Day after day, they fed the tunnel new airfoils and new cambers, testing not one or two, but dozens upon dozens of variations, until patterns emerged that felt like laws. A gently cambered wing produced more lift than a flat plate. The curvature mattered. The aspect ratio, the relation of span to chord, mattered. The center of pressure on a wing moved with angle of attack. At low angles it sat here, at higher angles it marched there, shifting the pitching moments that a pilot would have to fight or harness. Lift and drag were not abstractions, they were numbers they could hold in their hands, compare, and choose from. Control, meanwhile, was the thread running through the data like a steel wire. A controlled machine would need not only surfaces that produced force, but surfaces placed and moved so that a pilot could command the craft's attitude. From the bicycle came the instinct. To turn, first cause a roll. To cause a roll, create more lift on one side than the other. The brothers' idea, so straightforward, so profound, was to twist the wings themselves. Wing warping would change the angle of attack at the tips, raising one, lowering the other, and the craft would roll. But roll could not be isolated from yaw. Increase lift on one wing, and you also increase its drag. The craft yaws toward the lagging tip, adverse yaw, the enemy of coordinated turning. A movable vertical surface, a rudder, would be needed, not as an afterthought, but as a partner to warping, so that the pilot could swing the nose into the turn and keep the flow attached. Pitch, too, required purpose. If the center of pressure could walk forward and back as the wing bit the air at different angles, the craft might rear up or tuck its nose without warning. The solution the brothers favored early was a forward elevator, a canard, positioned so the pilot could command the nose without waiting for the tail to do the work. With a forward surface, a pilot could pull the nose up into more lift or push it down to regain speed, the way a cyclist shifts weight to correct a wobble. This was not only a choice of layout, it was a philosophy. Put the important control where the pilot can see and feel it, and make the machine lively enough to answer small corrections quickly. In the tunnel, all of this began to acquire numbers. A certain camber at a certain angle produced a known lift. The warping needed to balance a gust could be estimated. The rudder area required to overcome adverse yaw could be compared to the side area of the rest of the craft. The brothers built tables that turned air into arithmetic and arithmetic into parts lists. They were not chasing a blueprint handed down from a visionary. They were writing a grammar as they went, one coefficient at a time. By the end of their first winter of serious testing, they had corrected the literature they had inherited, produced their own, and framed the airplane not as a shape to be admired, but as a system to be controlled. This is where the bicycle shop mattered most. In a bike, a flexible frame is a fault. In a wing, flexibility could be an asset if it were harnessed. The Wrights had built wheels that ran true and frames that took road shock without wobble. They knew how to work wood so that it bent predictably and returned to shape. Wing warping was possible because they could build a structure light enough to twist and strong enough to hold. Control cables, pulleys, and clever linkages were the vocabulary of their trade, repurposed to teach a new machine how to obey. Their notebooks read like a pilot's future: roll, pitch, yaw. Named years before most pilots would use those words. Coordinate the controls, link the rudder to the warp so that when the pilot asked for a bank, the nose would swing neatly into the turn. Keep the elevator forward so that the pilot could sense and manage the angle of attack with immediacy. Avoid the trap of relying on passive stability alone, designed for an active pilot. A bird has nerves and muscles that act in milliseconds. An airplane would need a pilot and controls that let the same speed of correction happen in human hands. None of this would matter if it stayed on paper. The brothers understood the danger of seduction by theory. You can convince yourself that a number proves a craft will behave, only to find on a windy hill that the air has another opinion. So they made a second decision, as radical as the first. Choose a proving ground where wind is steady, sand is forgiving, and solitude is plentiful. They wrote to the U.S. Weather Bureau and scanned tables of average wind velocities along the coast. One name kept rising through the columns: Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. There, the air would give them a consistent teacher, and the sand would punish mistakes gently. There, they could bring their math to the dunes, carry a glider to the ridge again and again, and let method become muscle. By the time they packed their crates for the coast, the outline of an airplane existed, not as a drawing of a beautiful shape, but as a set of control principles anchored in data. Choose a cambered wing with proven lift. Build it light enough to twist for roll. Fit a forward elevator to bite the wind for pitch. Add a movable rudder to tame adverse yaw and coordinate the turn. Make every surface large enough to matter and responsive enough to be flown. Accept that stability is not a fixed property. It is a practiced relationship between pilot and machine. The brothers had reframed the entire enterprise. Flight was not a question to be answered by an engine demonstration or a leap from a tower. It was a controlled fall, tamed into a craft by a pilot who could command 3 axes with confidence. That is the problem they chose, the one they could solve with the tools they owned and the habits they trusted: careful measurement, honest testing, and the humility to let air teach them. The next step was obvious. Take the grammar they had written and read it aloud in the wind, on a strip of sand where the dunes run like waves and the horizon offers room to learn. Wind and sand, Kitty Hawk gliders, 1900 to 1902. The road to the first airplane begins at a place that looks like the end of the world. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, wind off the Atlantic, dunes like waves of pale stone, sand in the teeth, and a sky that never sits still. The brothers chose it on purpose. They had written to the U.S. Weather Bureau, scanned the columns, and circled this coast for its steady winds. They also wanted solitude. Headlines love promises, experiments prefer privacy. With help from locals, most memorably the Tate family, they pitched tents, built a shed, and turned a strip of empty beach into a school where the teacher was the air. The 1900 machine was not meant to dazzle. It was a tool to ask the right question in the right place. A biplane glider with a forward elevator and wings built to be twisted for roll, it carried the first shape of the brothers' control philosophy. They tested it as a kite to measure forces, then as a glider with a prone pilot, lying on the lower wing to keep the center of gravity low and the drag small. The results were mixed. The air did not deliver the lift the tables had promised. Flights were short, hops really, and the craft showed both promise and refusal. It would answer to warp and elevator, but it was skittish, the way a bicycle feels when the frame flexes more than the rider expects. The brothers went back to Dayton chastened but not discouraged. The grammar was sound, the numbers were not. They returned in 1901 with a larger machine, more wing area, more hopeful lift, because the book said more surface would solve things. The dunes taught a different lesson. The glider had a habit now. It would begin to oscillate and pitch, nodding up and down in a cycle that grew instead of dying. Pilot corrects nose up, the machine pitches too high, stalls, then dives. Pilot corrects nose down, the machine gains speed, the center of pressure slides, and the nose swings again. They called it well digging. It was dangerous and humiliating, proof that the center of pressure was moving across the chord in ways the received data hadn't predicted. The wind was steady, the theory wandered. On that beach, amid mosquitoes, salt, and sand that found every hinge and sleeve, the brothers were forced into a decision only real engineers make. Stop believing the tables. Trust what the sand is saying. They did not quit. They flew the 1901 glider hundreds of times despite its vices, instrumented it, and even tethered it as a kite to extract more numbers from the wind. But when the season ended, Wilbur delivered a sober lecture in Chicago and wrote a discouraged letter to Octave Chanute that read like a pause in faith. The problem wasn't man's courage or the shape of dreams. It was the data underneath the dream. The standard coefficient used to estimate dynamic pressure, the Smeaton coefficient, was too high. The air was stingier. Airfoils lauded in print were less generous in practice. If they wanted an airplane that obeyed, they would have to make their own book. Back in Dayton that fall, the bicycle shop became a tunnel of wind. The brothers cut, planed, and sanded dozens of miniature wings, built a 12-foot wooden wind tunnel, and designed balances that could separate lift and drag with fine resolution. They made the invisible visible and recalibrated the constants. A lower dynamic pressure coefficient made the world make sense. New airfoils, gently cambered with shapes they tuned by trial, produced reliable lift at angles that would keep the machine controllable. They began to understand not only how much force a wing would make, but where that force would act along the chord, and how it would shift as the angle changed. Numbers replaced guesswork. Control moved from hope to plan. Armed with this private textbook, they shipped a new glider to the coast in 1902. It did not look wildly different to a casual eye, a biplane with a forward elevator and a tail. But its soul had changed. The wings were built to the new sections proven in the tunnel. The structure was light, resilient, and true, capable of twisting when asked and holding its geometry when not. Most crucially, the brothers had added a new instrument to their orchestra, a movable vertical rudder at the rear. Earlier seasons had shown the trap called adverse yaw. Warp one wing up to increase its lift for roll, and you also increase its drag. The nose yaws the wrong way, and the turn becomes a skid toward trouble. The 1902 glider arrived with an answer. The rudder would not be a decorative fin, it would be a partner. At first, they tried a fixed tail, then a steerable one operated separately. The breakthrough came when they linked rudder and warp so that a single motion coordinated both. Twist the wings and the rudder swings to keep the nose honest. Roll, meet yaw. The airplane could now bank like a bird and keep the flow attached through the turn. The pilot's body became part of the circuit. Lying prone, hips in a cradle, the pilot could slide left or right to twist the wings and, through linkages, call the rudder to follow. Hands worked the forward elevator to place the nose where speed and angle needed it. Control ceased to be a set of levers. It became a conversation, continuous and intuitive. The sky began to answer yes. On the dunes at Kill Devil Hills that autumn, something new appeared on Earth, a heavier-than-air machine that could be aimed and held in the presence of wind. The brothers did not chase distance for its own sake. They chased repeatability. Day after day, they carried the glider up the slope and rode it down, practicing banks, corrections, and recovery from gusts. The machine would roll into a turn. The rudder would draw the nose through the arc. The elevator would hold the angle of attack steady, and the pilot would feel, for the first time, that the air was a medium that could be shaped by intention rather than endured. Witnesses from the village saw more than a trick. They saw men rehearsing a skill, gliding steadily, making S-turns across the face of the dune, then progressing to full circles. The glides ran longer, measured not just in yards but in controlled time aloft. The oscillations that had plagued the 1901 machine faded. The new airfoils held their lift predictably at practical angles, and the forward elevator, though still sensitive, was now part of a coordinated trio. The craft did not insist on a single speed. Within a band, it could be flown, not merely endured. Even the failures taught in a higher key. When a gust lifted a wingtip, the pilot could feel the roll and counterwarp before the machine departed. When the nose rose too eagerly, a small push on the elevator would recover airspeed before the wing quit. This was not passive stability. This was an active system in which the pilot's corrections, transmitted through warp, rudder, and elevator, created the very stability the machine needed. The bicycle lesson had come home. Balance is performance, achieved by a trained mind and quick hands, enabled by a frame that responds with fidelity. By October, the dunes were a workshop of confidence. The new glider covered hundreds of controlled flights that season, arcs sketched in air that ended on feet instead of in tumbles. The brothers began to speak a language every later pilot would recognize: coordinated turn, bank angle, recovery, slip, stall margin. They were not chasing poetry, they were codifying a craft. And somewhere between two ridges of sand, as the machine curved cleanly across the wind and straightened on command, a quiet line was crossed. Gliding ceased to be a fragile stunt and became a practical art. Two more consequences flowed directly from those days. First, the brothers now understood sizing. The tunnel data let them predict how much wing area they truly needed for their weight and wind, and how large the control surfaces had to be to bite the air decisively without overbalancing the craft. Second, they had trained themselves. No one else on Earth had this pilot's feel. Their hands knew what numbers could not teach: how quickly to feed in warp as the nose begins to drift, how much elevator to hold through a turn without starving the wing, when to let the rudder lead, and when to let it follow. The airplane was becoming an instrument that required technique, and the only two virtuosos alive were Orville and Wilbur. The 1902 season ended with a result compact enough to carry in a sentence and large enough to change history. A controllable glider that could turn where the pilot intended and return where he wished. Lift alone had not delivered it. Power had not touched it. Control had made it real. The brothers left the coast with a machine that could be commanded and a body of data that could scale. If you can steer a glider safely in wind, you can think about adding an engine. If you cannot, an engine merely carries you faster to your trouble. Back in Dayton, winter would mean drawings, fixtures, and negotiations with weight. But the heart of the matter had already been solved in sand. Roll by warping coordinated with rudder. Pitch by a sensitive forward elevator. A structure light enough to twist and strong enough to hold. Airfoil shapes chosen by measurement, not myth. And a pilot, trained, deliberate, at the center of the system, making stability out of instability with timely, proportional inputs. In 1900 and 1901, the dunes had argued with the brothers. In 1902, the brothers answered in a language the wind respected. The myth of flight loves firsts. The truth of flight loves methods. On those Carolina sands, the method was born. The next step would not be to get more ambitious, but to stay conservative in the only way that mattered. Keep control first, add power only as far as control allows, and let the data lead. December 1903 would one day become a date on calendars. but its possibility was written here, in 1902, in well-flown arcs across wind that had stopped being an enemy and begun to be a partner. Power and propellers, the 1903 machine. Add power, but do not let power lead. That was the rule the Dunes had written into the brothers' hands. In late 1902, with a controllable glider proven, they drew a new craft for the new season. The same grammar, warp for roll, forward elevator for pitch, linked rudder for yaw, now asked to carry an engine and its spinning air screws without losing its manners in the wind. Engines, in 1903, were either too heavy for their strength or too crude for their duty. The brothers wrote letters, weighed promises, and found no supplier who could deliver the essential ratio, horsepower per pound. So they did the audacious practical thing they always did, built what they could not buy. In the back of the Dayton shop, their machinist and friend Charlie Taylor cut metal for a 4-cylinder motor with a light crankcase and just enough strength to live through a few minutes at full load. It did not need to last like a locomotive. It needed to be light, honest, and strong enough. In a matter of weeks, the parts came together into a compact engine that would make roughly 12 horsepower, more than the glider needed to hold itself in the air, and just enough to push it through cold headwinds on a strip of sand. Power, though, is only half a propulsion system. Between engine and air stands the propeller, and in 1903, even experts treated a prop as a kind of boat screw driven through the sky. The brothers refused the analogy. Air is not water. A propeller is not a paddle. If a wing moves forward and creates lift, then a propeller blade, shaped as a wing and sweeping a circle, should create lift in the forward direction. Thrust. With that decision, the problem became one they already knew how to solve. They sketched a blade as a series of small wings, each at the radius it would sweep, each set at just the angle to bite the passing air without stalling. The twist along the length was not decoration. It was geometry tuned to keep the attack honest from hub to tip. They tested shapes in their tunnel math, carved the forms from wood, and produced 2 long, narrow air screws whose efficiency would surprise even later engineers. To cancel engine torque and steady the craft, they drove the twin propellers in opposite directions. Now came the integration. The 1903 Flyer was not a new idea nailed to an old one. It was the glider's control system built into a structure strong enough to accept thrust. Spruce and ash spars, muslin cloth stretched tight, bracing that let the wings twist when commanded and hold their line when loaded, a forward elevator big enough to bite the wind, a hinged rudder married to the warp so the nose would follow the bank. The pilot lay prone on the lower wing, hips in a cradle that moved left and right to warp the wingtips. A hand lever reached the elevator. The engine sat alongside the pilot, its power sent aft by chains and sprockets to the twin propeller shafts. Sand is a cruel runway, so they built a launching rail, a straight, level path of wood, so the skids could slide cleanly to flying speed instead of digging in. They did not hurry to the famous date. Early in December, a first attempt ended in a hop and a bruise to the machine. Proof again that pitch at low speed on a canard is a sharp tool. Lift is gained with a small pull and lost just as quickly with an overpull. They repaired the damage and waited for the right wind, the right firmness in the sand, the right calm in the pilot. On the morning of December 17th, the air over Kill Devil Hills ran steady and cold. They set the rail. They weighed the machine down against the wind with men and hands. They chose the first pilot. The takeoff itself was a test of control under power, not a leap. The skids trembled on the truck, the propellers clawed, and the Flyer accelerated along the rail, nose gently checked by the forward elevator to keep the angle of attack from rising too soon. At the rail's end, the skids left wood for air, and the machine sagged and then held, as the pilot found the small, continuous corrections the canard demanded. It did not soar. It learned. A few seconds that morning wrote a sentence no one had written before. A heavier-than-air machine with a pilot aboard rose under its own power and remained under control. They made not one flight, but 4. Each a lesson, each a bit longer, each flown with the same caution. Hold the nose, counter the gust, do not overcommand the elevator, coordinate rudder with warp as the wings begin to bank. The first was brief, a yardstick of possibility. The next 2 stretched into clear, controllable glides under power. The last traced a graceful, wavering line across the beach, nearly the length of a city block before setting down. The 4th ended with the wind catching the empty machine and tumbling it, breaking wood that could be mended but reminding everyone who the teacher still was. A man from the life-saving station had pressed a shutter at just the right instant, the most famous photograph in aviation, yet the picture cannot show the most important fact. The pilot's hands were in command from beginning to end. What did those flights prove? Not endurance, not yet, not altitude. The dunes were still close enough to touch with your eyes. They proved the point the brothers had argued for 3 years. Control first. The canard, sensitive as a violin string, demanded a light touch. The warping wove roll into the pilot's hips. The rudder, linked to that warp, kept the nose from sliding away. The engine did not make the miracle. It made the method visible. Without the tunnel data that chose the airfoil, without the geometry that sized the surfaces, without the habit of coordinating roll with yaw, the flyer would have been another brave crash. With them, it was a machine that could be flown. Even in triumph, the brothers saw work. The canard's very sensitivity meant a tendency to hunt and pitch at low speed. The pilot could damp it with practice, but a better arrangement might tame it by design. The skids and rail got the job done, but takeoff still depended on wind that would not always be there. The props had been designed by reason and carved by hand. They performed well, but their exact behavior in different air would need measurement and refinement, and the engine had done exactly enough. If they were to fly farther, turn cleanly under power, and climb in still air, they would need a more reliable takeoff method, a craft a bit more robust in pitch, and countless small improvements to reduce parasitic drag and improve control harmony. The miracle of 1903, then, was not the size of the flights, but the clarity of their message. By treating propellers as rotating wings, the brothers had invented a propulsion system that made sense to the air. By building their own engine, they had solved the weight-to-power riddle pragmatically, not perfectly. By keeping the control system, the warping, the rudder linkage, the forward elevator, at the center of every decision, they ensured that power did not overwhelm the pilot, but answered the pilot. A practical airplane was now imaginable, not as a bigger version of the same moment, but as a refinement of this controllable machine until it could take off where there was no forgiving sand, circle over a field, and return on purpose rather than by accident. They packed the broken, historic flyer for the trip home with a feeling history rarely captures, resolve rather than celebration. The world had seen a beginning. The brothers saw a list. So the next chapter would move from the coast to a cow pasture near Dayton, Huffman Prairie, where wind would be less steady, the ground less gentle, and the demands more like the work an airplane must do in the world. There, they would add a launching device to replace the coast's headwinds, tame the pitch so a pilot could fly without hunting, and turn power from an event into a routine. The age of demonstration was over. The age of development, methodical, stubborn, practical, was about to begin. From first flight to practical airplane, Huffman Prairie, 1904 to 1905. Sand had taught control. Now the brothers had to prove routine. They left the long winds and soft landings of the Carolina coast for a pasture outside Dayton, a rough grassy rectangle called Huffman Prairie, bordered by fences, cows, and an interurban rail line that would carry them and their crates to work each morning. Here the air was fickle, the ground unforgiving, and spectators few. Perfect conditions for turning a proof into a craft. They began 1904 with a heavier, strengthened machine, the Flyer II, built on the same grammar that had worked at Kill Devil Hills, wing warping for roll, a forward elevator for pitch, twin rudders at the rear coordinated with the warp. They laid a wooden starting rail across the grass because skids won't roll and waited for wind that rarely came. Without the steady push of the Atlantic, acceleration was sluggish. Liftoff demanded precision. Early attempts were short, cranky hops and brief skims, each one reminding them that a canard at low speed is a quick trigger. A touch too much elevator and the nose leapt, speed bled, the wing edged toward stall. A touch too little and the skids kissed grass again. The lesson was familiar. The airplane would not be tamed by wishful thinking. It would be tamed by method. Method gave them a new tool. In September, they raised a timber derrick and rigged a falling weight catapult, a heavy weight hoisted to the top of the tower, a rope over a pulley to the little launch truck under the skids. At release, gravity's stored energy yanked the machine down the rail into flying speed, whether or not the wind obliged. The catapult did not make flight easier. It made it possible on demand. Now they could test often when they chose, and practice the motions of takeoff with the same repetition they had given to turns on the dunes. Practice paid. On a September afternoon in 1904, Wilbur strung the pasture into a circle and for the first time in history turned an airplane all the way around to where it started, under power, under control. It was not long. Seconds stretched into just over a minute, but the geometry mattered more than the clock. A circle is a declaration. This machine is not flung, it is flown. The rest of the season became a logbook of progress. More circles, better takeoffs, cleaner landings, longer times aloft, interrupted by the stubborn realities of pitch hunting and the occasional dig into the turf that cracked spruce and pride. They repaired, revised, and refined. Technique matured alongside the airframe. The brothers learned to enter a turn with a coordinated sequence that every later pilot would recognize instinctively. Initiate roll with warp, feed rudder to keep the nose from sliding out, modulate elevator to hold angle of attack so the wing stays alive. They discovered how little margin there is at low speed and how to carry just enough extra to make a maneuver forgiving. They learned that the canard wanted a pilot's patience, small inputs, constant attention, no sudden pulls. The airplane was no longer a curiosity. It was an instrument that demanded skill, but the instrument still had a fault that practice alone could not erase. In July 1905, a heavy landing and a serious upset convinced them that the Flyer needed more than patches, it needed a rethink. So they built Flyer 3 and changed the machine in ways that look modest on paper and feel enormous in the hands. They moved the forward elevator farther ahead and gave it more area and better leverage, which softened its hair trigger and let a pilot damp pitch oscillations instead of feeding them. They increased the size and authority of the rear rudders and revised the control linkages so yaw and roll could be harmonized more deliberately. They strengthened and cleaned up the structure, trimmed unnecessary drag, and brought weight, balance, and responsiveness into a truer alignment. In sum, they made the controls proportionate, each surface biting the air in balance with the others, so that the pilot's corrections would stay corrections, not cascades. The catapult stayed, the pasture stayed. And suddenly, in late summer and early autumn of 1905, the field stopped being a place for brief proofs and became a circuit for real flight. Take off on the rail, climb, turn, cruise, descend, land, repeat. At first, the flights ran to minutes, then they ran past 10. On the best days, the brothers traced loop after loop over the same patch of Ohio grass until fuel, not control, set the limit. One October afternoon, Wilbur stayed aloft long enough to circle the prairie dozens of times, miles reeled off in a single continuous arc, then returned and set down near the starting point because he chose to, not because the airplane insisted. If Kitty Hawk had been a sentence, Huffman Prairie became a paragraph, then a page. Reliability changed everything. A practical airplane is not one that can be made to fly once. It is one that can be counted on to fly and to be flown day after day. The Flyer 3 behaved consistently. Control harmony meant the pilot could look ahead into a turn and know the airplane would answer in a measured way. The improved elevator meant that small pitch bumps could be arrested before they grew teeth. The more authoritative rudders made adverse yaw a partner to be managed, not an ambush. The twins learned a pilot's new reflexes. Do not let the nose rise in a bank. Carry the right speed into the turn. Feel the wing through the elevator the way a cyclist feels the road through the handlebars. They learned, too, the geometry of approach and landing, how to come downhill with energy in hand, flare without ballooning, and let the skids draw a clean line on grass. What emerged in 1905 was not a spectacle but a system. Airplane, catapult, pilot technique, field routine, maintenance habits, the 1,000 unglamorous details that turn invention into use. Chains were checked, cloth was retentioned, bearings were oiled, fuel was measured. A crew of 2 and the occasional helper could prepare, launch, retrieve, repair, and launch again with the rhythm of a shop that knows its work. The machine had quirks, every machine does, but the quirks were cataloged and bounded. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes only from length. A short flight can be a lucky balance of forces. A long one cannot hide bad habits. The long circuits at Huffman Prairie proved that the Wright method scaled. The same principles that held a glider steady across a dune held a powered craft steady across a quarter hour, then a half hour. Wing warping and rudder coordination did not unravel under heat and vibration. The propellers carved their invisible spirals with efficiency the brothers' notebooks had promised. The engine, simple, hand-built, honest, hummed within its limits and asked only the care its makers knew to give it. Even the place helped write the doctrine. Pasture bumps punished sloppy arrivals. Light winds exposed the airplane to its own shortcomings, with no coastal gale to hide them. The catapult insisted on preparation and reset times that made every launch a deliberate act rather than a whim. The interurban line set a workday cadence, parts and men in the morning, tired satisfaction and splinter repairs in the afternoon. It was not romance, it was craft. By autumn, the brothers had crossed an invisible line. They had built not just a machine that could fly, but a machine that could do work. It could take off where there was no beach, circle a defined space repeatedly without straining its pilot, and return near its start with fuel left. It could demonstrate a pattern to doubters, train its own builder to be its pilot, and deliver predictable behavior across days and weather changes. In modern language, the Wrights had moved from prototype to platform. With capability came caution. The brothers were not showmen. They were proprietors of a method they had patented and intended to sell. They flew out of sight when they could, kept diaries instead of headlines, and began to think like manufacturers as much as inventors. What does an army need to see? What will a government pay for? How do you protect the heart of the invention, 3-axis control, while proving the rest? Huffman Prairie was a laboratory, but by late 1905, it had also become a quiet sales floor where the product's virtues were being finished. The transformation of the airplane between 1903 and 1905 can be measured in facts. First circle, first sustained flights, longest duration. But its deeper meaning is simpler. Control matured from an idea into a habit. The airplane acquired manners. It could be asked to do something and would do it again tomorrow. That is what turned a picture on a beach into the beginning of an industry. When the season closed, the brothers crated the Flyer, and just as importantly, closed their field. They had flown far enough to prove more than a thesis. They had flown far enough to invite competition and copy. The next step would require lawyers as well as mechanics, patience as well as nerve. Patents were in hand. Negotiations began. Europe listened first. America would follow. The machine was ready. The world, curious, skeptical, hungry, was about to be shown. Showing the world patents, trials, triumphs, and trials. The first thing the brothers showed the world was a piece of paper. On May 22, 1906, the United States granted them a patent for a flying machine. Not a claim to wings or to power, but to the coordinated method of control that made wings and power obey. The heart of it was lateral control by differentially altering lift on the two sides of a wing, warping in their machine, but written broadly enough to cover any equivalent means that produced the same effect. In plain speech, roll must be commanded, and whatever device commands it is the core of an airplane. With that protection, they could seek partners without giving away the thing that mattered most. They still preferred proof to prose. In the spring of 1908, after 2 quiet years of development, they prepared 2 new flyers for trials, one for Europe, one for the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Seats replaced the prone position. A sturdier structure bore the marks of the hard lessons at Huffman Prairie. Controls were refined for a pilot who did not have the brothers' instincts. At Kitty Hawk in May, they rehearsed. On May 14th, Orville took a local mechanic, Charles Furnace, aloft, one of the first airplane passengers in American history, because the next stage would demand not only demonstration, but carriage of a human being as cargo, and because proof, again, is a thing you do. They split the world between them. Wilbur sailed for France. Orville headed to Fort Myer, Virginia, outside Washington, where the Army had set out specifications, and a parade of onlookers would measure the brothers not only by innovation, but by reliability. Wilbur arrived in a skeptical Europe. The continent had heard claims for a decade and seen little that could be flown as anything but a straight-line spectacle. In August 1908, at the Hunaudière racetrack near Le Mans, he assembled his machine with the quiet confidence of a craftsman. On the 8th, he climbed aboard, launched, and erased a decade of doubt in 2 minutes. He banked cleanly, circled as if the sky were a field he had measured, and landed on purpose where he meant to. The crowd did not merely cheer, they recalibrated. In the weeks that followed, he moved to the nearby Camp d'Ovour and flew record after record. Time aloft, distance, circles sketched like calligraphy above the French countryside, until the press stopped comparing him to others and started comparing others to him. The airplane, in his hands, behaved like a taught instrument. He trained French pupils, proved the method transferable, and turned skeptics into customers. Orville, meanwhile, faced a different test at Fort Myer. The Army wanted endurance, speed, load, and a demonstration of control that would convince soldiers their lives would not be wagered on luck. Day by day, in September 1908, he flew longer, higher, steadier. He set American endurance marks, circled the field at will, and carried passengers who descended with the dazed grin of men who had felt a new thing and found it trustworthy. Then, the air taught its hardest lesson. On September 17th, with Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge as passenger, a propeller fractured in flight, a structural failure that unbalanced the drive and shook the craft apart faster than a pilot's hands could heal. The machine struck the ground. Orville was badly injured. Selfridge died, the first fatality of powered aviation. The crash did not undo the method. It indicted a part. The brothers and the Army board that investigated traced the failure to the propeller. Materials and construction limits reached under stress. The response was the mark of engineers who meant to build a world, not a moment. They strengthened the air screws, revised driveline details, intensified inspection, tuned control harmony so that pitch could be managed with more margin, and treated safety not as a speech but as a design requirement. Orville healed through winter. Wilbur kept proving the case abroad. The following summer, 1909, they returned to Fort Myer with a refined machine and met the Army's bar line by line. Distance with a passenger, speed over a measured course, climb, turns, reliable landings. In late July and early August, the Signal Corps accepted the Wright military flyer, the Army's first airplane, because it did not merely fly. It could be flown to a standard day after day by pilots other than its inventors. Public faith followed public sight. That September, Wilbur crossed to New York and, during the Hudson-Fulton celebration, circled the Statue of Liberty and traced the Hudson River in a flight that welded invention to symbol. Across Europe, he had already sold machines and licenses. In America, contracts were now a matter of confidence, not persuasion. Late in 1909, the Wright Company was formed to manufacture airplanes and train pilots, incorporated in New York, building in Dayton, because an industry is more than plans and pride. It is factories, payrolls, and a curriculum. The field at Huffman Prairie became a school. Students learned what the brothers had learned the long way: how to enter a turn without starving the wing, how to keep the nose from wandering in a bank, how to carry speed into the flare and give it back to the ground, how to treat the machine as a system whose stability is created by a pilot's timely, proportionate inputs. Triumphs, however, travel with trials. The patent that protected the heart of control also drew a line through a young industry. Glenn Curtiss and other American builders embraced ailerons, small hinged flaps at the wingtips, to command roll. The Wright patent, written to cover the principle of differential lift for lateral control rather than only the mechanism of twisting fabric, reached toward those hinges. The courtroom became another proving ground. The dispute was not trivial and not petty. It was about whether an idea that makes flight safe belongs to one shop or to every shop for free. Judges read the claims, watched demonstrations, and, case after case in the years that followed, sided with the brothers' broad principle. If your device performs the same controlled act, commanding roll by unequal lift, it stands within the fence they had planted. The cost was real. Lawsuits slowed the pace at which American makers could collaborate, sell freely, and standardize. Engineers, though, are stubborn and pragmatic. Even rivals learned from the Wright method, whether or not they admitted it in court. Three-axis control became non-negotiable. Coordination of roll and yaw moved from insight to instinct. Control harmony, the proportional bite of elevator, aileron, or warp, and rudder, moved from art to engineering requirement. Builders disagreed about parts and profits. They no longer disagreed about the grammar of flight. Between demonstrations and depositions, the machines kept changing. The brothers' own designs evolved from the forward elevator canard to rear horizontal tails in later models, as experience in safety margins suggested a calmer pitch axis. Structures became cleaner, drag was hunted down and starved, props improved by both better wood and better mathematics. Engines crept upward in power without chasing brute force. The Wright Company trained a cadre of pilots and mechanics who carried the method outward into fairs, fields, and armies. In France and beyond, schools sprouted that mixed local innovation with lessons copied, adapted, or reverse-engineered from Dayton and Le Mans. The personal ledger was mixed and human. Public honors arrived, but so did exhaustion. Wilbur Wright, who had taught the world to bank, died in 1912 of typhoid fever at the age of 45, an absence that still echoes in every account of the era. Orville kept at the work, stewarding the company and the patent, while others rushed forward, sometimes learning the hard way what the brothers had already written in their notebooks. In 1913, a key court decision again upheld the Wright claims. Competitors hedged and licensed or fought on. The arguments might have continued indefinitely, but history has a way of overriding paperwork. When war seized Europe in 1914 and then demanded mass production from the United States as well, the government and industry pressed for a pooling of patents so that airplanes could be built in numbers without injunctions as ballast. By 1917, a cross-licensing arrangement allowed manufacturers to pay modest fees into a common fund and get on with the urgent business of filling the sky. What, in the end, did the world see in 1908 and 1909? And what did it keep? It saw a method work in public the way it had always worked in private: 3 axes, 1 pilot, 1 system. It saw that safety was an engineering practice, not a promise. It saw that an airplane could be taught manners so that a soldier, a student, or a barnstormer could learn them. It saw that propellers were wings that happened to turn, that an engine was a servant, not a master, and that a rail, a catapult, a checklist, and a school were as essential to aviation as cloth and spruce. It also saw that ideas have value, that law can protect invention, and that protection, if carried too strictly, can slow a field that lives by iteration. In the tension between exclusivity and spread lay a modern paradox that aviation would wrestle with for a century. The brothers did not stride a single stage and claim a crown. They opened 1,000 small doors. Governments bought, crowds believed, rivals argued and then adopted, students learned and then taught. The Wright Company became one voice among many in a chorus that widened with each season, but the melody remained theirs. Everywhere airplanes turned, the turn was coordinated. Everywhere airplanes climbed, a pilot managed pitch with measured hands. Everywhere airplanes rolled, some device, warped wood, hinged flaps, or metal surfaces, unequally lifted the 2 sides in obedience to a pilot's will. The world did not merely witness flight, it learned how flight is done. And learning, unlike spectacle, is permanent. The finale of their public proving was not a single day's record or a single contract signed. It was a universal habit installed in the minds and muscles of everyone who would fly thereafter. Control first, method always, and evidence as the only authority that matters. What the brothers taught the world. What the brothers taught the world begins with a refusal. Refuse the wrong problem. Where others chased lift and power as trophies, the Wrights treated control as the gate through which everything must pass. They made roll, pitch, and yaw the grammar of flight, then wrote sentences in the sky until the grammar held under stress. Mechanisms would change, warped wings giving way to ailerons, forward elevators yielding to tailplanes, cables to push rods, to hydraulics to fly-by-wire, but the syntax endured. Every airplane that banks cleanly through a coordinated turn speaks in their language. They taught that method outruns myth. A wooden wind tunnel on a bench balances as delicate as watch springs, notebook pages dense with figures. This is how a new domain is made legible. They distrusted received constants, measured the air as they found it, and let numbers rather than reputations decide. The habit they modeled, hypothesis, trial, error, revision, became the pulse of aerospace. NACA labs, university tunnels, digital simulations, flight test cards. The tools grew grander, the humility remained essential. They taught that propulsion is not magic, it is aerodynamics shaped into work. By seeing a propeller not as a screw but as a rotating wing, they drew thrust into the same family as lift and drag. Efficiency ceased to be a guess and became a problem of airfoils, twist, and angle of attack along a radius. That logic stretches forward from hand-carved air screws to constant-speed propellers, ducted fans, and even the thinking behind modern electric props and tilt rotors. If the air must be persuade it with a wing. They taught that an airplane is a system. Airframe, power plant, pilot, procedures, ground gear, none can be ignored without the whole suffering. A launching rail and a catapult were not accessories, they were enabling infrastructure. A field routine, inspect, rig, launch, recover, repair, was not busy work. It was the beginnings of operations. Today, the runway lights, maintenance logs, weight and balance forms, and training syllabi are more elaborate, but they answer the same insight. Flight is never just a machine, it is a practice. They taught that safety is engineered, not declared. After Fort Myer, they strengthened what failed, rebalanced what overreacted, and designed for margins a pilot could actually use. Control harmony became a requirement, not a compliment. From that seed grew a century's worth of design choices that favor recoverability over perfection. Tails sized to bite when needed, stall behavior shaped to warn rather than punish, later computers that smooth the edges without erasing the pilot's will. The brothers did not promise safety. They built for it and then proved it. They taught that skill matters and that it can be taught. Huffman Prairie was a conservatory where technique became shareable. Enter the turn with roll, coordinate yaw, hold angle of attack with the lightest hand, land with energy and reserve. The Wright School multiplied that knowledge until it belonged to a profession rather than to two men. From barnstormers to airline captains, from stick and rudder to simulators and type ratings, the line is straight. A craft becomes an industry when its instincts are codified. They taught that ideas have value and limits. Their patent said correctly that the heart of flight is controlled roll by unequal lift. Their lawsuit said, understandably, that such a heart deserved protection. The later pooling of patents said prudently that a field can die of legal success. Aviation absorbed all three lessons, and so did other industries. Protect what is essential, share what is necessary, and keep the sky open to improvement. And they taught, finally, how to see. The photograph of December 1903 is famous, but the real portrait hangs elsewhere. Two men bent over a balance in a drafty shop, a dune traced with S-turns, a pasture carved into circles, a ledger of flights that grow by minutes instead of headlines. They made the notebook the first runway. They showed that progress is not a leap but a cadence. Measure, try, learn, refine, until the improbable becomes routine. From fabric wings to metal skins to composites, from magnetos to turbines, from open air to pressurized cabins and onto space planes and drones, the surfaces and powers have changed. The grammar has not. Every roll begins with unequal lift. Every climb pays its price in drag. Every landing succeeds by energy managed and angle held. The brothers did not merely add motion to a new axis, they gave the world a disciplined way to master it. How did flight begin in America? Not with a single triumphant dash into the wind, but with a durable habit of mind. Control before engine, evidence before applause, system before spectacle. That habit traveled farther than any one airplane could. It moved from a bicycle shop to a century of airfields and factories, into the hands of pilots and the pages of textbooks, across oceans and through generations. The age they opened is still opening, one measured correction at a time.